Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off. We left off with going through these various kinds of transactions where there are specific rules about how to deal with these transactions. They're more complicated than the simple exchange rule, and these are the rules that make up the law of community property. The next transaction we want to look at is life insurance and retirement benefits and disability pay. Life insurance and retirement benefits follow the time rule. The situation where these come up is where the person has, for example, worked as an employee at the ABC Corporation, and then they get married. They were separate. They were single first. Then they get married. So they worked for 5 years for the corporation. Then they got married. Then they worked for 20 years. And then comes retirement time. In retirement time, if they get a divorce, how should the retirement benefits, whether they get a divorce or not, how are the retirement benefits owned? And the answer is that the person worked there 5 years separately, 20 years while married, so they worked there a total of 25 years. 5 of those 25 years, the person was single. 20 of the 25 years, the person was married. Well, 5 out of 25 is 20%. So 20% of the retirement income is separate property. 20 out of 25 is 80%. So 80% of the retirement income is community property. If they get divorced, that's still the way that money is owned. The life insurance policy is the same thing. If you pay for part of the life insurance policy out of separate property money and pay for other parts of it out of community property money, you look at the fraction of time. Let's say the person paid altogether 50 years on this life insurance policy. 10 of those years the person was single, 40 of those years they were married. Well, that means that when the insurance policy pays off, 10 out of 50, which is 20%, 20% of the life insurance proceeds is separate property, and 80% is community property. That's called a time rule, and you use the time rule in those examples I gave you. Disability pay. Now, disability pay is interesting because disability pay is pay that a person gets. They were working at this factory or something. They're now disabled, and they are. If they're getting money that, no matter what you call it, if they're getting money that is in lieu of their wages, the person was working there and they are temporarily disabled for the 3 months, and they get pay in lieu of their wages because they can't work right now. Well, the money that comes in lieu of wages is treated just like wages. Okay, if they're married, it's community property. If they're separate, it's separate property. If they're married but living separate and apart, money that you earn while living separate and apart is separate property. So money that comes in as wage replacement money is treated just like wages. On the other hand, if the person is disabled and this is not wage replacement anymore, this is money that the person has received because they are totally disabled and they're not going to be able to work anymore. And it is, and the state or the corporation, whoever it is paying them money now because they were injured at work and they're not coming back. Okay, that's not wage replacement. That's just paying the person money now because they're totally disabled and society wants to give them something to live on. Or the corporation may be obligated to give them something to live on. But this is not a wage replacement anymore. Okay, and that money is. That money is not the same as wage replacement. If the person is married when they receive that money, it was acquired during marriage, and it'll be treated as, it will still be community property, even though it's not wages, because it's acquired during marriage. And if they are separated, it's still, so that money really is property acquired during marriage, and if it's acquired during marriage, it's community property unless they are separate, living separate and apart. And if they get divorced, the key thing that's interesting about that is that if they get divorced, that money doesn't get divided up or something. If they get divorced, the money that comes in after dissolution is just separate property. That's we'll look at a real problem dealing with that. The education expenses. The problem dealing with education expenses happens when the person is married. While they're married, they go to school. And they go to school, some kind of a school where it substantially increases their earning capacity. I don't mean they go to school where they learn to finger paint or something. They go to school that substantially increases their earning capacity, and the community pays. And I'm not talking about the community paying for their food while at school, because the community would have to pay their food if they never left the house. But we're talking about paying for books and tuition and that kind of school cost. And now the person graduates from law school, medical school, architecture school, something, so that they now can earn a lot more money. And now, let's say, immediately after graduating, there comes a divorce. Well, if there's a divorce, what do you do about all this money that the community has invested in this person's education? And what we do is we say, well, if the person has stayed married for 10 years after they increased their earning capacity, then the community in effect made an investment in that person. That's the way to look at it. The community invested in this person's education. And now as soon as they invest, the person says, I want a divorce, they get divorced. What are you going to do about the community's investment? And the way that is handled is that if the parties stayed together for 10 years after the investment in their education, then the community is presumed, rebuttably presumed, to have been adequately compensated for their investment. If they, I said it backwards. If they stay together for 10 years, if they stay together for 10 years, then the community is presumed to have been adequately compensated. If they don't stay together for 10 years, let's say after 4 years, there comes a dissolution, the presumption is that the community has not gotten a return on its investment yet. And therefore, the education expenses have to be paid back to the community. So the investment is paid back if the community has not gotten a return on its investment yet, and the 10-year presumption is the way that's handled. Remember that the 10-year rule is only a presumption, and so many times, the great majority of the times, when the bar examiners have a situation where, create a situation where there's a presumption, a rebuttable presumption, they very commonly give you some facts which you might use to rebut the presumption. So always try to rebut a presumption if it's rebuttable. Next comes the personal injury awards. Personal injury awards, first of all, assuming that it wasn't one spouse who injured the other, we talked about that briefly, that's separate property. But ordinarily, an ordinary personal injury award, if a person is injured, if the cause of action arose during marriage, then the money that is received for it, because of it, the money can be received after dissolution, during separation. Doesn't matter when you get the money. If the cause of action arose during marriage, then the compensation is community property. Okay, but it's a funny kind of community property. I call it funny community property. It's a funny kind of community property because you treat it a little differently than you do the rest of the community property. So if the cause of action arose during marriage, it is community property. It's right here in the code, by the way, that says that section 781. Section 781 is the one that tells you that if the cause of action arose during marriage, the stuff you get is community property, but it's a funny kind of community property. The code tells you it's subject to certain provisions. What's funny about this kind of community property? A couple of things that are funny about it. First of all, the person who was injured has the right to exclusive management and control of that money. Okay. Normally, if you have community property, each party has an equal right to manage and control the money. But if it's money from a personal injury award, the person who was injured has a right to the exclusive management and control of that money. And if that money becomes commingled, and by commingled I mean beyond identification, if it becomes commingled with other community property, it loses its special character. And it's because it will lose its special character if it's commingled that the other side has the right to keep it managed separately. So that's one thing that's special about this kind of community. This money that you get from a personal injury is called community estate personal injury damages. And that's a term that's a term of art. It's right there in the code section. Community estate community estate personal injury damages. So community estate personal injury damages are if the cause of action arose during marriage. If the cause of action arose during marriage, these are community estate personal injury damages. Now, these damages, it's 5 words. Please memorize it. Okay. Now, these damages, again, these are community property. Okay. This is community property, but subject to special rules. And there are 2 special rules that it's subject to. One of them is the one I just told you about. That is that if the injured spouse has the exclusive right to manage and control this, and you let it get commingled with other ordinary community property, then it becomes ordinary community property. The second rule that this is subject to, the second rule is that upon dissolution, you ordinarily divide community property half and half. Okay, this is funding community property, and it is not divisible half and half like other property. Instead, there's a special code section that applies to this. Is section 2583. To sure I got the right number here. Yeah, I'm sorry, first 2603. That's wrong. This is Family Law Act, section 2603. And the 2603A, section A, says this stuff is community property, but it's subject to, but don't commingle it. And B tells you how to divide this, what to do with this kind of community property in case of dissolution. And the answer is what you do with this kind of property in case of dissolution is 2603B. Take a look at it sometime. It says the starting point. And people I so often hear this being put backwards and it has a different meaning. Read the code, okay? And what it says is that the starting point is give all of this community estate personal injury damages to the injured party. That's the starting point. You don't quit there, but that's the starting point. And then it's except as the interest of justice requires otherwise. But always give them at least 50%. Community estate personal injury damages. Let me read you the code so you really, because for so many people, I don't know where they get it from, a bad lecture somewhere, someplace, but I want to be sure you get this straight. 2603B, right here, this is where I am. 2603B says, community estate personal injury damages shall be assigned to the party who suffered the injuries, unless the court, taking a bunch of things into account, decides the interest of justice, says give the other person something. But always be sure the injured party gets at least half. Okay, and that's how that works. Details later. The next type of property that we're concerned about is the management and control. Well, that's not complicated. The party, if you have separate property, you have the exclusive right to manage and control your separate property. If it is community property, each party has an equal right to manage and control the community property. Now, the only exceptions to that are things like a law practice, for example, which is community property, let's say, because it was started during marriage, etc. So the law practice is community property, but your spouse does not have a right to come and manage and control the law practice. A medical practice where somebody is a surgeon and the medical practice belongs to the community, well, the non-medical spouse does not have a right to come and manage and control that business. And you have a real estate office and it belongs to the community, but you're running it. The other person can't step in there every day and run that business. And so you have those are exceptional cases, and the community still owns half of it, but the other person cannot come in there and manage its day-to-day activities. Credit acquisitions, property which is acquired on credit belongs to the person whose credit was used. And so if the community property credit was used, the property belongs to the community. If separate property credit was used, it belongs to the separate property owner. Creditor's rights. The creditor's rights are basically as follows. If the creditor is a separate property creditor, however that may have happened, maybe the person became a creditor before marriage. So the separate property creditor you owe somebody money before marriage, you get married, and the separate property creditor still has a right to get their money. But the way they get their money is they go after your separate property first. When that's exhausted, not enough, they can go after the community property next. And when that's used up, they cannot go after the separate property of the non-debtor spouse. And that's how that works. If you started out as a community property debt, spouse number one runs up a debt at a Macy's or someplace, and the creditor goes against the community first because the debt was acquired during marriage, goes against the community first. When the community can't pay it anymore, you go after the separate property of the person who acquired the debt, not the other. And when that's all gone, the creditor cannot go after the separate property of the person who did not cause the debt. For unmarried couples, these are the cases of the putative spouse, and the basic idea is that if neither spouse thought there was a marriage, then you treat it just like these are separate individuals who are just living together, and there is no marital relationship, and nobody thought there was one, and there's no special issue there. The two people who are not married and living together can have a contract arrangement if they want to. And if they made a contract with each other, then of course that contract is enforceable. But in Marvin versus Marvin, the same issue came up, and the court said they didn't even have a contract, and so it just wasn't there. Secondly, if one party thinks they're married in good faith and the other person knows they're not, then the good faith spouse, that good faith person who thought they were a spouse, gets treated economically as though they really were a spouse at the expense of the person who was not the real spouse. And finally comes the preemption issues. The preemption issues are those cases where the federal government has a rule that takes priority over the community property laws. If the federal government says, for example, that a soldier's insurance policy, even though married, and is a soldier, military person, and they have a life insurance policy, and that life insurance policy, the soldier can name anybody he or she wants to. It does not have to be the spouse. Okay, they have total freedom to name anybody. That's a federal preemption situation. A few other situations come up dealing with U.S. government bonds and Social Security in those places. Okay, so that is a run-through of the primary area, of all of the areas where you have complications in trying to sort out who does the money belong to, how much of it belongs to separate property, how much is the community. And those issues constitute the overwhelming bulk of community property law. The other, more like 10% really, just has to do with these special cases, creditors' rights that we talked a little bit about anyway, and are these people really married? Now, with that overview in mind, and I hope that helps us get a good perspective on community property, with that in mind, let us turn to some problems. Let's begin with the problem on let's begin with the problem on, sorry about that, I'm trying to choose the one that's most practical to begin with. The problem from the February 2001 bar. The February 2001 bar, it's about Herb Wanda Home Mutual Fund and Cabin, and from February 01. It begins at line 6. It says Herb, this department says in 1980. Now it says any place where you got to watch the dates. It's in these community property problems. You really got to watch them because timing is a big deal. It's like forming a contract. In forming contract, the order in which things happen can be very, very important. So let's take a look here at the February 01 question. It says, in 1980, Herb married Wanda. Okay, they got married in 1980. And the couple took up residence in a California home. Okay, they are married and domiciled in California beginning in 1980. Keep that straight. Which they took up residence in a California home which Herb had purchased in 1979. Aha! Herb purchased the home before marriage, so the title to the property is in Herb's name alone, and it was his separate property before marriage. If he had paid for it completely before marriage, we wouldn't have a problem. It would be his separate property. But if he only made a down payment and a year later got married and now is using community property money to pay the mortgage, now we got a problem. Because the community, every time you make the mortgage payment, the principal portion of that payment goes towards ownership by the community, because the community is making the payment. Line 9. Herb bought the home for $50,000. Now, whatever fraction of that $50,000 that the community paid for, that's the fraction of the home that they're going to own. Even if the home becomes exceedingly more valuable, the community still owns that fraction. So Herb bought the home for $50,000. He made a $5,000 down payment. Okay, well, 5 out of 50 is 10%, and so he's paid for 10% of it. Okay, already. But under marriage of more, this is the marriage of more problem. Under marriage of more, what we do is we focus on what ownership does the community have. Do not try to figure out what ownership does he have, because that can get very complicated. It gets complicated when there are mortgage payments and the property is not fully paid for and there's still a mortgage left and who owes the mortgage and that sort of stuff. If you do it that way, you're inviting unnecessary complications. In these marriages of more problems, calculate the community ownership. Pay off the community and let the other person do what they want to do. Okay? And so the $5,000 down payment, which he made, is interesting, but we don't really care, to tell you the truth. And he signed a promissory note for the balance. Okay. At the time of the marriage, the outstanding balance on this note was $44,000. And so, since the outstanding balance was $44,000, the outstanding balance was $45,000 when he first bought it, because he made a $5,000 down payment. So the outstanding balance was $45,000, and this means that during the 1 year before he got married in 1979, that he made another $1,000. He reduced the principal by another $1,000 by making payments, probably. In any event, there's $44,000 remaining. During the next 20 years, the couple paid off the note by making payments from their combined salaries. Well, you tell the bar examiners that what Section 760 says. It says all property acquired during marriage is community property, unless there's a statute that says during marriage while domiciled in California is community property, unless there's a contract, unless there's a statute that says otherwise. So their salaries during marriage were community property, and they paid off the $44,000 using community property. So what portion does the community own? Well, the community paid $44,000. This is a marriage of more problems. So the community paid let me back up here. The community paid $44,000 out of $50,000. Therefore, the community owns 44 out of $50,000. That's the percent that the community owns. It owns 44 out of 50, and let me get a So the community owns 44 out of 50. This is the fraction owned by the community, and that equals 88%. Because you agree that 44 out of 50 is the same as 88 out of 100. So the community owns 88%. Okay. Now, so the community owns 88%. This property is fully paid for. You could have a situation where there's still some balance left. It doesn't matter. If the community paid for 44 out of 50, even if there were a balance left, the community still owns this percentage. And so the house is worth $200,000. So the CP portion, CP, I don't know what you call them, CP right, is 88% of $200,000. Okay, well that's easy. 88% of 200,000 is what's that? 176. And that's how you would do that. The community is owed $176,000. The rest of it, what's missing here, about 24,000. Well, that belongs to that 24,000 belongs to his SP. But you can just say SP owns the remainder. And that happens to be 24,000. But you don't have to calculate that. In this case, it's easy to calculate because the house is fully paid for. But if the house were not fully paid for, you would still calculate how much did the community pay. And once you know how much the community pays, you know how much money you have to give. Half of that money to the other spouse. And so half of this. And so what happens here is that H gets, W is the one you got to pay off here. Because the house is, the W gets 1/2 of 176,000. Be sure to do that 1/2 calculation. W gets 1/2 of the 176,000. Now H is going to get more. H is going to get his 1/2 of the 176,000, just like W, but H is also going to get the other $24,000 that came. This really came from his $5,000 down, $6,000 that he had used separate property to put in. So that's how you do marriage with more problems. Let me do one more marriage with more problems for you. It's not one of the assigned problems, but you can quickly see how it works. Please take a look at in your What to Write book. Sorry, marriage and more problems. I'll have them in just a second. This particular problem, by the way, is done on page 16 of your What to Write book. This What to Write book here is solved on page 16, which you see on the board of this problem. This book. But we want to look at another one of these marriage and more problems. There is another one on page 17 of the What to Write book, and on page 17 of the What to Write book is a marriage of more problem where they wanted you to explain, not even make any calculations, just explain everything. So they really wanted to see that you understood it. The next marriage or more problem I want you to look at is on page 18. Page 18 of the What to Write book. And let me read it to you and do the calculations as we go. Page 18. Page 18 says, in April of 1976, H's aunt died, leaving him desert land in California. The property was worth $30,000, okay, but was subject to a purchase money encumbrance with an unpaid balance of $10,000. So really, what he inherited was worth $20,000, because the property is worth $30,000, but it's not fully paid for. So he's got like a $20,000. It's as though he has used his separate property to pay for $20,000 of it. And the balance was payable, there's a $10,000 balance, payable at the rate of $200 per month, including principal and interest. That means that every time that $200 monthly payment was made, some of it went towards the principal and some of it went towards the interest. Next line. Between 1976 and 1981, that's a 5-year period, H paid off the encumbrance with 60 monthly payments from a joint checking account which consisted entirely of H's and W's salaries earned during marriage. Well, obviously the money in that bank account is community property, but if you just say that to the bar examiners, it'll cost you a bunch of points. You got to explain why the money in that bank account is community property. It's community property because all property acquired during marriage while domiciled in California is community property unless there's a statute that says otherwise. Earnings during marriage, therefore, are community property because these people, there's no statute that says it's not. The statute says if you agree that the earnings are something else, that's okay, but you don't have that. So therefore, their salaries acquired during marriage is community property. These salaries are used to finish paying for Blackacre. Therefore, it was paid for with community property money. Now, $10,000 was paid for with community property money. Let's take a look at that. So, 10,000 out of 30,000. Paid with CP. Therefore, CP owns 10 out of 30 equals 1/3 of the Blackacre. Whatever it's worth now, the community owns a third. And they told us in this case that it's now worth $45,000. Okay, so Blackacre is worth $45K. CP owns $15K because 1/3 of 45 is 15. And don't forget to divide this in half. Okay, H gets 1/2 and W gets 1/2. Now H inherited this property, so this 15,000 goes 7.5 to H and 7.5 to W. And that's fine, but don't forget that H is the one who inherited the property. And so the $20,000 that had already been paid goes to H. So H is going to get the $20,000 that had been paid before he inherited it, plus the $7,500 that he gets from this. Now, that's how these marriage and more problems work. I don't think we need to do another one. There's another one in the book here if you need to do one more. We will pick up with the February 01 question at line 14. So going back to the February 01 question, line 14. In 1985, Wanda sold for $10,000 a watercolor which she had painted that year. Now, before we pursue this further, I want you to know what the rule is, because you can then analyze the facts as they come up if you know what the rule is. So let me tell you what the rule is so it's more efficient. The rule that we're about to deal with is at section 852. And if you open your codes to section Section 852. Section 852 tells you what to do. You should read 850 and 852. It's 852 that has the detail. And in fact, take a moment and read it right now. Stop your computer, please, and read 852, because if you don't read it, you're going to the bar exam based on what other people said about it. Okay, and the bar examiners aren't interested in that. They want to know what the law really is. And 852C says, and first I'll take 852A, a transmutation of real or personal property is not valid unless made in writing. Let me read this carefully to you. It says, again, 852A, we're going to do 852A and 852C. Those are the two sections we're most concerned with. 852A says, a transmutation of real or personal property. If I want to give my spouse some real or personal property, is not valid. So if Mary and Joe are married, and Mary says to Joe, Joe, you can have the car. Joe, you can have the painting. Okay, they say that transmutation from community to separate, or any other transmutation, community to separate, separate to community, separate to separate, whatever it is, the transmutation is not valid unless made in writing by an express declaration. Express declaration means you can't figure out that the person probably wanted to make the transmutation. It's got to be clear, expressly clear. An express declaration that is made, joined in, or consented to, or accepted by the spouse whose interest in the property is adversely affected. This means this person can write out the express declaration. Someone else can write it out for them, and they consent to it. Now, it doesn't say made, joined in, consented to, or accepted by the spouse whose interest is in the property is adversely affected. I don't know any cases that give the exact details of what is meant by accepted by the spouse whose interest is adversely affected, or joined in, or consented to. I don't have good examples, and I obviously have an idea of what those mean, and so do you. And if this comes up on the bar, you'll have to, argue that standard. So you need to write it. This is 852C. 852C says, this section does not apply to a gift between spouses. So if I just want to give my spouse, make a gift, it does not apply to gifts between spouses of clothing. So let's see, if I buy a pair of shoes and give them to my spouse, don't have a writing, well, the code says that's okay, I can buy that spouse a pair of shoes and give it to her and say, here, dear, these are yours. It's your separate property. Your shoes are no longer community property. And so I can do that. It says, this section does not apply to a gift between spouses of clothing, wearing apparel, jewelry, or other tangible articles of a personal nature that is used solely or principally by the spouse to whom the gift is made. So what is that? Tangible articles of a personal nature. A painting, a piece of artwork, but not stock. That's not a tangible item of a personal nature. A painting might be, a piece of artwork that one donates to their spouse might be. It's certainly a tangible item. Stock is not a tangible item. And is a painting of a personal nature? Well, maybe, make an argument. It's got to be used principally by the donee spouse. Well, if I give you a painting, you're my spouse, and I give you a painting, and you hang it in your office at work, well, that's used principally by you. But if I give you a vase, an art vase, and it's left there in the house in the living room all the time, it is not used principally by you. And so, and the last part of this, item C, that it is not substantial in value, taking into account the circumstances of the marriage. Not substantial in value. So if I'm Donald Trump, and if I want to give my wife, my spouse, a car, it's not substantial in value. In fact, maybe I want to give her $100,000 piece of jewelry. It's not substantial in value. But for most of us middle-class folks, it would be. And so you have to take that into account. So 852C says you can make donations to your spouse of clothing, jewelry, wearing apparel, tangible articles of a personal nature. Now, every time this has been tested, the issue of is this a tangible article of a personal nature? So remember that code section. So you can give that kind of stuff, provided that stuff meets two requirements. It's used principally by the donee spouse, and it is not substantial in value, taking into account the circumstances of the marriage. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at what happened in this problem. In this problem at line 14. At line 14, it says, in 1985, now first of all, were these people still married in 1985? Well, you look at the dates, you see, yes, they were. Wanda sold for $10,000 a watercolor she had painted that year. Okay. She and Herb orally agreed that the $10,000 would be her sole and separate property. Well, did that work? Well, it looks like they tried to give her the $10,000. And the $10,000 is not a tangible item of a personal nature. Now, the watercolor was a tangible item of a personal nature, and the watercolor she painted during marriage. So the watercolor really belonged to the community. But he can give her his half of that if he wants to, but it's got to meet these rules. So was the $10,000 an effective transmutation to her? You can't give her $10,000 in that way. Now, obviously, he could have given her the painting, because that is the painting probably is a tangible personal item of a tangible item of a personal nature. So maybe he could have given her the painting, but even so, the painting is worth $10,000, and these are not real rich people because their house only cost $50,000. So a $10,000 gift is 1/5 of the value of the house. Well, the house is now worth $200,000. It's going up in value, but if the house is worth $200,000, that's some indication that these are fairly middle class folks, and that a $10,000 gift might very well be substantial as to them. And so there's no writing. So it looks like there's not an effective transmutation for several reasons. The $10,000 is not a tangible item of a personal nature used principally by the donee spouse. And secondly, the $10,000 is probably substantial in terms of their marital circumstances. And then Wanda invested the $10,000 in a mutual fund, and the mutual fund is now worth $45,000. Well, that's probably all community property. The main thing here is to use the code. Use the code. If you write about it and talk about how it seems right to you and they ought to do this and they should do that, that's a zero. Okay? The bar examiners don't want to know your social opinion. You've been given a license to practice law. And when people come to you for law practice, they're not coming to you for your social opinion. They want to know the rule of law and what's going to happen when you apply it. And so here, you need to use 852 to analyze this. Next comes line 18. Line 18. In 1995, Herb and Wanda bought a vacation cabin on the California coast for $75,000. Okay? Is this still during marriage? Yeah, they're still married. And they bought this, and they bought it for $75,000. Well, we need to find out where the money came from. It says they made a down payment of $25,000 with community funds. Okay, so a down payment, that's they used community property funds, and they both signed a note secured by a deed of trust on the cabin for the balance. Well, they both signed the note, so it looks like it's community property credit that's being used. So there was a community property down payment. Don't just say it. They told you the down payment was was community property. So they used a community property $25,000 down payment, and they used community property credit. They both signed it, and they are using community property credit. The title of the cabin was taken in the names of both of them as joint tenants. Well, it wasn't taken as community property, but first of all, it doesn't say joint tenants with the right of survivorship. And if you don't put the right of survivorship in there, a lot of jurisdictions won't treat this as joint tenancy property. You got to let the parties know that joint tenancy means the survivor takes all, and you put some words in there to that effect. So, first of all, it says joint tenants, and that title might be ignored, it might be treated, if you ignore the joint tenancy, you end up with tenancies in common. But even though they took the property as either joint tenants or tenancy in common, it was bought with community property. And what the courts will do with this is they'll treat it like community property. Now, nobody died here, so you didn't have to decide whether this really was a joint tenancy or not. But the courts will treat this like community property. How do we know this? Well, we know this because partly of marriage is more. And when we come back and look at marriage is more, we will, not marriage is more, but Lucas. We know this because of the Lucas legislation. When we come back from our break, we want to look at the Lucas legislation and see how it would apply to this problem. Let's take 10. We're actually only going to take a couple minutes, but you can take as much time as you want with your computer.